Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Welcome to winter solstice. It is snowing on Vancouver Island right now, so it definitely feels like winter. I'm going to be taking some time off during the holidays, so I wanted to put out one last video before Christmas, and winter solstice is a fitting time to talk about winter wildlife. So I will be sharing a live stream that I've recently done with Connel Bradwell on my Instagram page, where we talk about winter wildlife and all of the fun and exciting adaptations and interesting biological mechanisms that allow animals to survive winter and to survive some crazy long migrations. I hope you enjoy the replay of this live stream. Thank you guys for all of your support this year. I hope you guys can take some time off this holidays and recharge a bit from this crazy year. Thank you guys so much and enjoy the video. So today's theme is going to be winter wildlife. So we're going to talk a little bit about the fun things that happen with wildlife in the winter. And, you know, I guess this is kind of coming from a North America or Northern Hemisphere lens. So,
yeah, I was thinking that, but I was like, you know what, that's what we know. So what can we do?
yeah, if it's summer where you are, then you can learn more about North American wildlife.
Yeah, just be thankful it's not winter for you, so it's fine.
Let's first maybe start by talking about winter in general and how different wildlife species handle winter. And I was doing a bit of research on this, and I read this like sentence that said that winter is like a driving force for evolution. And I thought about that. I was like, you know what? I never really thought about it that way. But, you know, animals deal with less nutrient availability in the winter, less light, less thermal energy, like everything that makes them thrive, basically. And so now they have to evolve these unique strategies to survive, you know?
I guess that's such a good way of thinking about it. I never really think about that, but you're right. It really does like turn the dial up on them. It puts a lot of pressure on a species to be able to survive the winter, and you have to literally decide, are you going to stay and fight it out, or are you going to just go? And that's a whole other risk in itself. That's definitely been a push for evolution. And I mean, a lot of migratory patterns, at least in birds, are depicted from the Ice Age as well. Like that's, you know, they would follow as the glaciers receded, birds started to spread up into new landscapes, and then they would continue to go back to where they, you know, where they were originally from, because they knew that that was safe. There's a few species like wheatears, for example, which are like these little kind of yellowy birds up in the north, and they go all the way out to like Russia and down. And they think that they like followed the ice as the ice receded. They followed it, and then they're like, oh well, we know where it's not going to be as cold, so they go back to that spot. Migration, it just blows my mind all the time.
I know, same. Like, especially, well, good introduction to what I was going to talk about next. That's the choice that wildlife have to make basically during winter. And it's not really like a conscious choice. It's like it's evolution, but theoretically wildlife species have to choose whether or not they're going to stay and try to go like deal with all the lowered nutrient availability, surviving the winter. And then within that, are they going to stay out on the surface and like try to hunt and find food, or are they going to enter hibernation or torpor? So there's two pathways there, or they're just going to say, you know what, I'm not going to do this. It's worth the energy to go and migrate somewhere where we can get way more food. And so those are the choices that pretty much all species that face like these seasonal fluctuations have to make.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting. You start to understand, the more that you understand about the birds and about the wildlife, the species, I should say, the more their decisions, the evolution that they've gone down, the path that they've taken makes sense. So a good example is if you think about songbirds that migrate, so warblers, swallows, for example, a lot of them have in common, at least within the passerines, they're insectivores. So insectivores migrate predominantly. Why? Because up here in the Northern Hemisphere, where it gets cold in winter, you don't have as many insects, if any, access to insects. So you need to move south in order to feed. But the birds that we have staying, like the nuthatches, the chickadees, the sparrows, are they eat seeds, or they eat they eat berries, for example. So they don't have to move. They just have to they can feed throughout the year. But there are some birds, this is interesting, like yellow-rumped warblers. I actually just found this out recently. They can change their diet. So they
Mm.
can switch. So they switch from being insectivores in the spring to being berry eaters and seed eaters in the fall and the winter. And so yellow-rumped warblers will migrate, but they don't need to. They switch. They're eating the berries, so they'll move on eventually. But for now, what's the rush?
Non-bird wildlife will actually do the same thing too. So red fox will do that, is they'll primarily eat berries and whatever is seasonally available in the summer, but they'll actually switch to small mammals in the winter just because small mammals can be like quite abundant.
Mhm.
You always see a lot of the snowshoe hare running around all year. So they'll actually just switch their diet from that. So it's not just birds that can do that.
Yeah, and it makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're eating what's around, but being able to switch is pretty interesting. Especially again, I'll bring it back to birds, but especially from a bird point of view, where it's like physiologically you're designed to eat insects. You have to change your body to eat
Mm-hmm.
seeds, be able to process seeds. Think about processing insects as opposed to seeds. Um, and then there's some species, and this is a species that I'm seeing a lot of. Like if we go for a hike, we'll see them. They're everywhere this year. Crossbills.
Mm.
And so they are like little tiny birds, red. They've got a crossed bill like this, look like they need braces. They and they have those crossed bills to help them get into the pine cones. It's like specific pine cones. But because the cones that they eat are abundant in the winter, they can breed the whole year. They will sometimes sit on a nest in the middle of winter.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which is crazy. So they can feed their young. It's fine. Yeah. So I always think that sort of being able to it's all just about food. At the
Mm-hmm.
end of the day, that's what it's about. Have you got any good mammals that you're
Yeah,
you
so I have
know?
a few different ones. So I was thinking like if we're on the subject of like adaptions that wildlife make to survive through the winter and they don't hibernate, maybe you're going to torpor. I think probably, well, okay, so to continue on birds, I think probably some of the most common ones from when I was in Alberta that you hear through the winter is the black-capped chickadees. They are just happy as clams all winter. They're always one that just from a personal note, they always just kind of kept me happy. The chickadees are so cheerful and happy, like,
They've got the right name for it. Like a
yeah.
chickadee, they just fit it perfectly.
Birds actually, I mean, there's quite a few migratory birds, but the reason why birds can adapt in the winter is because they can create their own heat. So an endothermic, right? I'm going back to science class. Some animals, they cannot create their own heat. So I think the most fascinating animal in the winter is frogs. So this is the weirdest animal fact I think I know, maybe. So do you know about wood frogs in the winter?
They they freeze themselves, right? But I don't know that is that correct? Like I just don't know the intricacies of it. So like, please, I'm ready to learn.
I just wrote some like amphibian papers at work, so this is all really fresh in my mind. So 70% of the water within the wood frogs freezes solid and their hearts stop beating.
Whoa.
But they're still alive, and it's like it's a certain form of glycol, sort of like antifreeze, like that's what's in antifreeze, and it keeps them alive, but their heart actually stops beating and they'll like completely freeze. That makes me confused of what even a life is, because I didn't realize your heart could stop beating and you'd still be alive.
Yeah, like yeah, exactly.
Some of them, I think leopard frogs will stay in the liquid water under the frozen surface of wetlands. So most of the time it doesn't freeze all the way to the bottom if it's deep enough. So some amphibians will stay in the water that's still liquid at the bottom. And then other ones, there's actually a little bit of mystery of where they even go. So Western toads specifically, I haven't reviewed the literature on Western toads, so unless someone's discovered this recently, it's kind of a big question of like, we don't actually know what they do.
Love it. I
Like,
love animal mystery. I love it.
yeah, like the theory, I think, or like the hypothesis that people have is that they bury underground. Um, but like it just is, there's still so much up in the air. Yeah, someone asked in the questions, if a wood frog freezes and its heart also stops beating, does it cease all brain activity? You know what, imagine being the biologist researching that and putting like brain, what are those called, brain things like on a frog. I don't know.
Wiring up a frog brain for life to see if there's anything going on in there.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if they dream while frozen solid. Yeah, amphibians is an interesting one because it also affects, I mean, just from the applied ecology world, knowing where they are in the winter affects how we can protect them in the winter from winter construction activities, oil spills. Like, we need to kind of know where they are so we can save their little frozen bodies. So hopefully some more research coming out around that because it's really fascinating.
Because I know that for Western turtles, who also bury themselves
Mm.
under here, or sorry, painted turtles, Western painted turtles. Here we have because they're endangered on the island, so there's like certain parks and locations where they are next to the ponds, but they just have it like fenced off. They say this is Western painted
Mm.
turtle wintering habitat, but you wouldn't think anything of it. That's why it's important to know because it's just a field. Or there's one, some of them in this equestrian area that you wouldn't know unless you wouldn't look at it and go, oh, there's turtles down there. Like you wouldn't know. So that's why it's really super important for those kind of species, especially the endangered ones.
Yeah, that's a good point. And also, too, anything, I mean, with frogs just burying down, if they're not collected in one spot, you kind of just don't know where they could be. But then a lot of reptile species will have hibernaculums where they're actually all together underground. And if you've ever seen a video of a snake hibernaculum, it's the weirdest thing.
When they're just all together, right? They're just all in this massive group. That's some people's nightmares. Not mine, but some people. Yeah, the frogs, that's wild. And snakes. I mean, all of those kind of species. And that's someone said that's why we have wood frogs can survive in Alaska, and it's why we have them in Canada as well, because um without them, without that adaptation, we just wouldn't have them. Like we don't have many like lizard species, for example. We do have some, but not many.
How do birds evolutionarily know where to go in regards to migratory routes with the changing seasons? And I think I actually have that as a question too in my question box. Let me see. Well, do you want to start on that one?
That's a great question. So there are some birds that actually get shown by their parents. So there are some birds that will accompany their parents there or will follow a flock. But many of them, it's just in their genetics. There are, which is crazy to think. Like there are many birds whose parents leave them when they're young, when they obviously have just learned to fly, and then they are expected to just go. And they've just got something in their genetics, something in that mind that tells them that they need to go south and where they need to go. I don't really, when they don't always like go to the same sort of spot. I mean, some birds do, some birds don't, but generally, a lot of them, we always say like, oh, they travel down to Central America, for example. So I don't think you necessarily are going to go to, like, if your parents go to Ecuador, I don't think you necessarily are going to Ecuador as well. You kind of, it seems like they get to a spot where they think, oh yeah, this is good. We're going to just, stay here and get our territory. And some of them will like, go back to the same spots after that once they've established a territory down there. But yeah, I thought that's a good question. We don't always know.
Yeah, and some of this, yeah, you're right. There's still a lot in the air. I was specifically reading about monarch butterfly migration the other day, and there's so many different theories of whether they can directly tap into the magnetic field of the Earth, or if
Yeah.
it's like they use the position of the sun to determine like their directions just based off of the sun and like the position it is in direction to the horizon. Like I couldn't do that.
Which so for birds, like birds can, that's a good point. Birds can use the magnetic field. And sometimes they are able to recognize, some species are able to recognize landmarks as well. But a lot of birds migrate at night.
Mm-hmm.
So they're doing it without the sun. Maybe they genuinely might be able to read the stars. which is insane. And like, that is insane for a bird, but for a butterfly, like, I mean, that is mind blowing to me.
I think that really, when I think about that with butterflies, it makes me question what we even consider intelligence. Like, so many people see humans as the most intelligent species,
Yeah.
questionable. But I couldn't do that. Like, and I also have a butterfly book I'm reading. How do certain mammals know when to bulk up their fur and to grow winter coats? And so the obvious answer you'd think is, oh, well, when they get cold, they'll just grow more fur, right? But how do dogs and cats grow winter coats inside when it's climate controlled? Like dogs and cats still get winter coats. So it's not always just temperature. And some of the research that I was looking at was actually wildlife will be able to detect, and this isn't conscious. They don't just decide in the same way. I don't think I'm going to just start growing my hair longer. It's all under the surface, but the changes in the length of the day and the amount of sunlight that they're exposed to will create different hormonal changes. And hormones change with exposure to sun in humans and in wildlife too. And hormonal changes can actually trigger, in the darker days, growing a winter coat.
I know that for some species, this is where climate change kind of comes into into reality. I guess not reality, what's the word, but you can actually see aspects of climate change having an impact. Is that you'll see some birds, mammals, who are changing their coats to white, and there isn't any snow on the ground because long-term warming will mean that, and that's interesting because it's to do with the days. So yeah, the days are obviously getting shorter. That causes the change, but obviously it's still a little bit warmer out.
McDaniel actually says that if there's climate change, that causes warming, will animals still need to hibernate? And that plays really good into the comment about Vancouver Island being warm. So like, it's not like bears are going to freeze to death or anything here, but there's still lower nutrient availability, and hibernation is often triggered by lower nutrient availability. So less of the like when their bears are foraging for berries, there's still, even with climate change, I can't imagine berries are not going to just grow year round. It's still going to be those seasonal changes in their forage food and their diet. So it's easier, I guess, on their body to hibernate when there's no food available and to just shut down as much unnecessary activity as possible. And then when they wake up, there's way more food and they're able to gorge themselves on all their berries.
Their favorite thing to eat when they wake up, one of the things they love to eat is skunk cabbage, one of the first things to hear, and it makes them poop. Because after hibernation, after a few months, you gotta go. It's always, everything's a bit cooked up. So that gets everything going. There you go. So which wildlife thrives the best during the winter is a good question. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, I thought about this one a bit before we started. And I was like, okay, well, what would you consider thriving? Because there's a few different options here. I mean, there's like animals like wolves that can do quite well in the winter because they can grow such thick coats. Wolves do not worry about the cold weather. They're so toasty in their coats. It's not even a question for them. But when animals that are predators, when they have better lines of sight, that always helps like increase their chances of getting their prey. And the one nice thing that you'll notice about the winter, especially if you have a background in finding bird nests, because this is something I personally learned doing bird nest sweeps, is it's so much easier in the winter to just see through all the leaves. Like you can see the birds a lot easier that are there because there's no like big leafy trees in the way. I imagine it would probably be quite similar for a lot of carnivores that are hunting, as they're probably going to be able to see their prey easier. And with like, for example, caribou, when they're making tracks through the snow, the wolves can just follow those tracks and follow it right to a caribou. So a lot of animals are able to hunt a lot easier in the winter.
Yeah, the thrives is a really interesting one because I feel like for a lot of species, winter is a real slog. Like they're able to do it, but it's a slog, and it's always a kind of, you're on the cusp of life and death, especially at least for birds. But I think there are mostly, I think, like you said, the predators are able to do quite well. I was thinking owls, for example, like great horned owls. I don't think they particularly, I mean, they started nesting in January, so they must be doing something right. Like, I don't think that they are particularly phased by winter.
Yeah, and I kind of had another thought too about like what constitutes thrives. And if it's a freezing cold, for example, Yellowknife winter, what about animals that just hunker down and stay warm in a den? Or, for example, beavers. The beavers will stay in their lodges through most of the winter, and the lodges will actually like this the water between them will freeze, and they'll be really sturdy all winter, and they're just cozy and warm and fat in there. And honestly, that sounds pretty nice to me.
No, that sounds good. Yeah, I agree. And it also depends on where we're talking about. This is why we're just the worst. Like scientists, we can't answer a question because we're like, oh, but where and what and you know, but where? Because here in for winter, there are so many species that are thriving that have come from the Arctic. So
Mm.
species like trumpeter swans, for example, and the sea ducks that come from like surf scoter and harlequin ducks and those kind of birds who come from the north, they're having a great time down here because it's mild. Like this is tropical for them. So I don't they wouldn't thrive in the Arctic, so they leave and they come here for winter and they're having a great time. I saw a bunch of them the other day. They looked like they were having fun.
Yeah, sea ducks is it's a good time for them. Tips for learning tracks in the snow, and just some winter tracking tips in general. So winter is a really interesting time to track, and a lot of biologists do track in the winter, particularly ungulate specialists. So there's a lot of like winter caribou surveys, and winter is just a very quiet time to track. If you're ever in, like, for example, the boreal forest in the summer, it's like the amount of birds just like making a ruckus and animals crashing around. It's so loud and overwhelming. In the winter, if you are in a snowy climate, it is so quiet and you can hear like every little bit of movement. So it's a interesting time to be out there for this like winter snow work. So if you want to do some tracking, the best time to do it in snowy climates is after like a light snowfall, on like that nice morning after the snow has fallen overnight, because all the tracks are nice and fresh in the snow. So that's probably the best time to do it. Like I was saying earlier, the absence of the leaves and the heavy brush makes things a lot easier for just moving between the trees, especially in like the boreal forest where you are bushwhacking all summer and it's so dense you can't even get in. So it's a good time to go out there. I think too, as far as like actually learning your tracks, you'll want to pick up like a good tracking book, and there's also many like online resources as well too. There's classes you can take. Naturalist groups go out in the winter. COVID maybe isn't the best time for finding those group walks, but you can always get a book at the library and check it out. And the last thing I'll say on this that's really cool is, and Connell, I know you haven't spent a ton of time in snowy climates.
Yeah.
One of the coolest things about winter tracking is seeing the wing prints, I guess that's what you would call it, from raptors.
I've seen pictures.
And it's actually from their wings hitting the snow and landing and grabbing like a little snowshoe hare or something.
Yeah. I will say, having not spent much time in the snow, like the UK is just wet and Vancouver Island is wet. But we don't have snow here, so it's a little bit trickier. But we do have a lot of mud. And that is sometimes a good, at least I've, found bear prints and deer prints and stuff in the mud. It's not as good as the snow. I'm not going to pretend, but you got to use what you have.
Why do some birds choose to overwinter? And we can use the hummingbirds here as an example for that one.
That's a great one. Choose is always the interesting word, but there's a lot of birds who are able to survive here in the winter. So that's because of their food. So they're able to eat seeds and berries. They don't have to leave. Migration is, we always kind of I don't know. I always picture it as being like, oh, lucky them, they're off to the tropics, and I have to stay here, blah blah blah. But it's a really dangerous journey. Like migration is massively risky. It takes a lot of energy out of you, and a lot of like birds don't make it. That's the reality of it. You know, there's a big percentage that just don't do it. So staying around for the winter has your benefits in that you get to stay here, and you don't have to risk migration. And if you are able to feed, even if it's sparsely, but you're able to feed and survive, then why not? Like, why would you put yourself on a migration that you don't need to do? Because it's extremely risky. There are birds like Anna's hummingbirds here on Vancouver Island that have started to overwinter when historically they wouldn't. And so this is a change in their behavior that's based around people feeding them. So lots of people here on Vancouver Island and in Vancouver, West Coast, you know, Washington State, feed hummingbirds. And Anna's hummingbirds have realized that if they're just being fed the whole year, then they don't need to move. They don't need to migrate. They're able to stay. And also, because it's so mild here, we have flowers from people's yards. So not wildflowers that they would historically have to rely on, but garden flowers. They can be blooming in the winter as well. So they'll feed on that. I saw one recently. I don't know what the type of flower was, but just, you know, out in someone's yard, and it was the hummingbird was feeding, and it was doing fine. So Anna's hummingbirds have actually changed their behavior, so they don't move south. They're able to stay there the whole year, which is really cool. I mean, it's amazing seeing hummingbirds in the snow. Like, that's a pretty cool thing to see.
But yeah, it's something really special we get to enjoy here. But the kind of interesting thing, the flip side of that, is if something happened to humans and we were no longer there putting our feeders out, would the hummingbirds go back to how they used to do it? Or maybe they wouldn't do so well. They would choose not to migrate, and then it's too late, and now they don't have any nectar. So they kind of now rely on us. So you got to keep your feeders out in the winter now.
Big. That's why I tell people, like, feed the hummingbirds. If you're feeding them, just keep doing it.
Well, so we answered most of our questions that we got. Was there anything else you had in your notes that you wanted to share with people?
Well, actually, someone asked about what animals were breeding during the winter, and I thought that the ones that I could think of were elephant seals. We have them off the coast here. They're breeding. Great horned owls. They start nesting in January, so they'll be breeding. And I mentioned the crossbills that can nest throughout the whole year.
So I gotta hop off, but thank you so much for chatting, and let us know if you want to see more of these and what other sorts of topics that you want to see. But have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.